Livery Company, distinguished guests, pray silence for the Master.
Ladies and gentlemen, very warm welcome to this Tutt Rivers Lecture, our annual event. I'd like to start off by reminding you that it's 2024. Now, I suspect most of you know that, but if you don't, I thought it'd be helpful. That's significant because, again, as most of you will know, not all of you, this is the 40th anniversary of Sylvia Tutt as Master. Great event because she was the first Lady Master of any livery company in the City of London. It's significant because we named or renamed this lecture in her honour when we got involved with the Tutt Rivers Lecture, or the Rivers Lecture, which became Tutt Rivers, including her name. And this lecture is substantially financed by a legacy, a very substantial legacy, that Sylvia left to this company. Now, in a minute or two, I'm going to ask two of my illustrious colleagues to explain two of our initiatives, very briefly, as I keep telling them, very, very briefly, to show you what else we do with this legacy. And we're doing increasing amounts. I shouldn't say that because I'll get voted down. We do a lot with the legacy, but we're very careful how we do this, and we have other things in mind for the future. But these things are mainly educational, including this lecture. So the two luminaries I would like to step up here are Past Master David Locke, formerly chair of the Education Committee, and a very fruitful period indeed it was under his chairmanship, and the current chairman, Sheila Lumsden, and things are going very well. Each of them will explain to you an initiative each of which has started. So if you'll come up, David. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Master, wardens, liverymen, distinguished guests, thank you very much indeed for allowing us to report on this. 12 months ago, at this prestigious event, we announced the start of the company's first ever research project into how a focus on values could improve governance for the benefit of all. And we invited participants to join with us and Leeds Beckett University in the project. We undertook to keep you informed about the progress of the work. The fundamental premise underpinning the research was that good governance is not so much about codes of practice or compliance, but more about a way of life based on values which inform the strategic decisions of organisations and the behaviour of staff. A total of 12 organisations from 5 different sectors have volunteered to join with us, and 27 interviews have now been held with company secretaries and staff at different levels of their organisations. The findings from the literature search include those which show that companies which are most successful over the long term are those which incorporate their cultural values at the core of their everyday business operations and implement value-based management practices. The findings from the interviews show that companies in different sectors have a range of different values, differently expressed and embedded in different ways with clear links to governance processes, risk management, human resources, working practices, strategy formulation, and leadership effectiveness, with the power to change cultures and improve performance. Participants in the research have been inspired to review their practices. We anticipate that the participating organisations will use the findings from the interviews within their organisations to review and refine or reform their processes to achieve improvements in their performance and governance. We anticipate that the analysis of all cases will result in resources that will feed into a values focus in governance training and in the selection of directors. The research project is ongoing, and there are opportunities for organisations not currently involved to become so. If you are interested, please contact me, Maria, who is here this evening, our researcher, or our clerk if you would like your organisation to join in or you would like to find out more. The findings from the project will be featured in the Lord Mayor's virtual Connect to Prosper lecture at 3 o'clock on the 22nd of April under the title Governance to Prosper, the Importance of Integrity, Values and Policy. There will also be other opportunities where the findings, which are still emerging, will be presented. Finally, I would like to thank the Tutt Fund, the Worshipful Company, and Leeds Beckett University, who have supported the research financially. Members of the steering committee, some of whom are here this evening, the research team at Leeds Beckett University, and all those who have helped us to get to this point. I look forward to the research having greater impact for the benefit of the governance profession and those it serves. Master, thank you very much.
Master, wardens, liverymen, freemen and distinguished guests. Before we hear tonight's Tutt River Annual Lecture, it gives me great pleasure as Chair of the WICSA Education Committee to announce the launch of the inaugural Sylvia Tutt Award. As Master mentioned, 2024 is the 40th anniversary of Sylvia Tutt being the first female Master of the Worshipful Company of Chartered Secretaries and Administrators. Not only the first female Master of our own company, the first female Master of any livery company in the century's history of livery companies in London. Sylvia led the way for many more females subsequently to become Master of this company and of many other companies. It is therefore appropriate to mark this 40th anniversary, and we hope this award will become an annual award for many years to come. The award itself is open to those studying governance at master's level at a UK university, or anyone who is in early career in the first 5 years of their governance career. Anyone wishing to apply will need to complete the application and write a 1,000-word article, the subject of which will change each year. To ensure the quality and validity of entries, we're also asking participants to include 2 endorsements in their application from their studies, work, or voluntary work in governance. This year, the topic chosen for the 1,000-word article is values in governance, very much picking up on what has just been talked about in terms of our research. As past Master Locke has just been outlining from the research being undertaken, values are essential to good governance and service with integrity, the motto of this company. The question being posed for this year's inaugural award is, looking forward, what do you think is required of the governance profession to uphold and ensure values are respected by all in an organisation, from the board to all staff? And secondly, what evidence can you personally provide of how you live the values of your organisation, or how you have supported the development of an organisation's values and the engagement of staff and board with those values? Those applying who are still students will be able to use examples from their university life or voluntary work. The award is open for applications from today, with all details on the WICSA website, and a closing date of 12th July. The judging panel will consist of a maximum of 5 people, drawn from our own company's liverymen and freemen, and a representative of the Chartered Governance Institute. The winner will be announced at the October livery dinner. The prize itself will be £1,000 to spend on continuing professional development through the Chartered Governance Institute, as well as access to the Worshipful Company of Chartered Secretaries and Administrators for 1 year. Through the Education Committee, we already work with a number of partner universities, and I hope that all students studying governance at master's level will be encouraged to apply. If you know of anyone or have anyone in your team who's in the first 5 years of their governance career, do encourage them to apply and have the opportunity to win £1,000 to spend on their career development. Sylvia Tutt herself was passionate about developing professional knowledge and the exchange of ideas between professions throughout one's career. As she said, nothing works in isolation, without friendship and without knowledge. We hope, therefore, that she would be delighted the Sylvia Tutt Award will ensure that focus on continuing professional development. I would like to thank the Master for the suggestion and commitment to such an award, the WICSA Court for their support of this award, the Tutt Fund, and hopefully the funding agreed on an annual basis for at least the next 10 years, and also to the Chartered Governance Institute for their support in promotion and judging of the award. Do please direct anyone who might be interested to the WICSA website for further details. I look forward, with my fellow judges, to some great summer reading and announcing the first winner of the Sylvia Tutt Award in October. Thank you, Master.
Well, without much more ado, the lecture itself. As many of you will know, or I hope you know, my theme for this year is the company and business. My own background, in a nutshell, involves dealing with businesses that perhaps, let's call, slightly wayward, need sorting out, need drawing back into a more normal world. But I thought in that context, who better to give this lecture than my good friend Geoff Rowley, who is the CEO of FRP Advisory. He will tell you all about what they do, possibly quite luridly, I don't know. I do hope you enjoyed this. Geoff is a true professional and has certainly helped me in some very difficult and fairly intractable circumstances. Over to a real professional.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and firstly, can I thank the Master for extending his kind invite for me to deliver this lecture this evening. By way of introduction, my name is Geoff Rowley, and I am the Group CEO of FRP Advisory, a specialist advisory firm. I'm a chartered certified accountant and a licensed consultancy practitioner. I've been working in the insolvency profession, or more currently referred to as the restructuring profession, since 1990, and have therefore been through a number of economic cycles, including the early 1990s recession, the dot-com bubble of the 2000s, the global financial crisis of 2008, and the challenges presented by Brexit, COVID-19, and geopolitical impacts such as the war in Ukraine. We are now dealing with the early stages impact of there once again being a cost to borrowing money, having had an extended period of money effectively being free. Whilst I am the CEO of FRP, somewhat unusually, I spend the majority of my time dealing with live client matters, and that brings me into daily contact with boards of directors who are normally facing significant challenges and stresses, often for the first time in their careers, even if they've had long careers. FRP is an organisation, whilst having its genesis in the world of restructuring insolvency, developed over a number of years to support companies, their boards, investors, and other stakeholders across a broader range of services, including debt advisory, corporate finance, forensic services, along with a broader financial advisory team which deals with matters such as financial due diligence, valuations, and pensions advisory. We therefore support our clients across a significant part of the life cycle of an organisation. Our very existence can in some ways be traced back to a failing in governance, as we emerged from the failure of a PLC who had sought to act as a consolidator of accountancy practices, but in doing so failed to address many of the basics of running a business, let alone the requirements of being a PLC. One of my abiding memories was finding out after the failure of our former employer that the finance director had failed to produce a group-wide balance sheet for the monthly board meeting for over a year, which he put down to the challenges of consolidating newly acquired businesses. A more likely reason, however, was that he had failed to pay HMRC the correct amount of PAYE that had been deducted from employees to the tune of £1 million a month for over a year. The board was blissfully ignorant of such a liability. So when FRP, as a traditional partnership, came into existence in 2010, we took a somewhat unusual decision at that time to have a board in place from day one. We had a non-exec chairman, non-exec directors, and a finance director who, whilst well remunerated, was an employee rather than a partner, with a very clear mandate that the number one requirement was to ensure the board and wider partner group was presented with accurate and timely financial information every month, whether our performance was good, bad, or otherwise. Being aware of our true financial position was key to ensuring we knew where we were as a business, and that of course provides a key foundation to making informed decisions on how the business might develop. If we then roll forward to 2019, when we decided to explore the prospect of listing our business on the alternative investment market, which we successfully concluded in March 2020, immediately before another interesting period with the commencement of the COVID-19 lockdown. As a listed company, governance of course is heightened, but I would offer a view that having had the benefit of non-exec directors in our business since inception, the change to being a listed business was more one of evolution than revolution. Now, I know there's a lot of very informed people in the room tonight, but I will make a comment of what do we mean by corporate governance. And whilst there are various interpretations, I think the succinct definition of corporate governance being the system of rules, practices and processes by which a company is directed and controlled provides a clear starting point. Although I was very interested to hear the importance now of values forming part of that as well, and I know as our own business, the issue of values and what that means in terms of how we conduct ourselves throughout the organisation becomes of ever greater importance. The reality, of course, is that across the world of business, not-for-profit organisations and the public sector, there will be many different approaches to governance, ranging from a very informal approach through to a very codified approach. Governance will touch on many areas, including risk management, board oversight, transparency, disclosure, stakeholder engagement, executive compensation, don't like that discussion, but there we are, regulatory compliance, long-term sustainability and purpose, and of increasing importance, continual evaluation and improvement. I suspect most people here this evening would agree that governance is ultimately about instilling trust and confidence, both internally and externally, that an organisation is being run in a proper manner. So what have I experienced when dealing with governance in turbulent times? I think I would start by saying that for many organisations, their biggest strengths are their people, and at the same time their biggest weakness are their people. The introduction of turbulence, some of which might have been self-inflicted, and some of which might have been arisen due to matters entirely outside of the control of the organisation, is likely to introduce stress. Stress may arise in many areas, including the financial performance of the business, and therefore relationships with such as lenders and investors, the relationship with the organisation's employees, where there are concerns of future prospects, ultimately job security, relationships with key suppliers and customers who are concerned as to what is happening within that organisation, and the prospect of increased regulatory oversight or even intervention. Ultimately, that stress will find its way back to the management, to the board, and to the owners of an organisation. That, of course, is people. And how those people react and behave can be very varied. I will try and cover a few of the themes that we see when we're dealing with businesses in this environment as to how people behave. My first theme is denial. One of the most common reactions we see is the impact of denial. Having now been in practice for over 30 years, I'm a little sad to say that there has been a constant in my career, which is the ability of UK boards and management teams to fail to recognise their challenges and take early steps to address the same. I remain somewhat confused as to why this remains the case in 2024, when we have so much access to information. But we do still seem to have a business culture where asking for help is seen as a sign of weakness. Compare that to the United States, where the opposite seems to apply. And boards will do very little without having first engaged with lawyers to ensure what they are doing is correct. I'm not suggesting we should seek the same position here in the UK, but something in between would seem sensible to me. The biggest impact of denial is normally the loss of potential choices around how an organisation might address its challenges. And with less choice, the outcome is normally a poorer one than it might have otherwise been. I'm reminded of a very challenging assignment we dealt with a few years back, which was to advise a very long-standing charity which was focused on supporting people suffering from severe deafness and other significant conditions. The charity ran a school along with a number of assisted living accommodation units. Such was the severity of the health challenges faced by their users. They also ran a 24/7 hospital. The charity was one of only 3 in the country who provided such services. As a charity, it was ultimately run by a board of trustees. The charity, however, was very much a business and had commercial relationships with many parties. Bank borrowings, had a pension deficit, had over 300 employees, and was subject to significant regulatory oversight. Its customers were mainly local authorities around the UK who funded payments for the services they provided. The charity had been aware of its ever-increasing financial challenges for a period of time. It was afraid to ask its customers for a price increase because it was concerned that local authorities might withdraw people from their organisation and that they would send pupils and residents elsewhere. And whilst all of the trustees were very well-meaning, decisions, and certainly tough decisions, were not something that they were used to undertaking. We were introduced by their bank and made clear recommendations on what steps should be taken, and had understood that between the trustees, the bank, and a cost-effective specialist turnaround advisor, such recommendations would be progressed. Roll forward 7 months, and out of the blue comes a phone call saying the charity had run out of money and needed to enter into administration in a couple of days. There followed one of the most stressful times of having to deal with the closure of the school, both for financial and regulatory reasons, breaking this terrible news to families, seeing children moved into old people's care homes as the only source of immediate care, politicians seeking to make political capital out of the situation, and hundreds of amazing staff losing their jobs, and all just before Christmas. I cannot guarantee that the outcome would have been different had our recommendations been followed. I would have least expected to have avoided an unplanned closure with the horrible impact that had on many families and their loved ones. The impact of denial. Another thing, the subservient board. We commonly see a position where a board under pressure decides, and I would say sometimes knowingly, sometimes unknowingly, the best course of action is to defer to the dominant CEO and founder. I was engaged a couple of years to advise an AIM-listed company that was experiencing financial difficulties. The business had been brought to market as a potential significant growth stock, and its founder and largest shareholder had previously been an early-stage investor and board member at a hugely successful online retailer, where investors have made significant gains. The new business therefore attracted quite a following, and a lot of retail investors who were hoping that history might repeat itself. Huge gains might be achieved if the business could deliver on its plans. There were a number of challenges as to why history might not repeat itself, not least because whilst the PLC and its board were based in the UK, the underlying business was in the subcontinent. The actual performance of the business was that it consistently missed its targets and had to undertake a number of fundraisers to continue to operate, raising both equity and borrowing money. Ultimately, it got to a point where it became clear that it would not be possible to raise more equity or debt, and we were engaged to try and find a buyer for the business. Again, the most likely outcome being a sale via an administration process. That process ran for a number of months and involved us being invited to attend various board meetings, sometimes for the whole of the meeting, sometimes for a limited part. The board itself was on face value full of experience, with members from the Big Four, 2 members of the House of Lords, and a seasoned expert from the world of fashion. What became apparent to us from an early stage, however, that there was only ever one voice in the room that was heard, and that was of the chair being the founding chairman. He was sufficiently in control that he was able to make sure that only matters he wished to be discussed were discussed, and had an amazing ability to produce the minutes of the meeting almost immediately upon it concluding. Not what one might describe as effective governance. When the company ultimately failed, the founder was the only party wishing to acquire the business for limited value, with an outcome of there being no return to shareholders. Somewhat unfortunately, the very same day as this entity failed, the founder sold another one of his businesses for a very, very significant sum of money, which was publicised in the media. The position then developed with an ad hoc group of shareholders being formed who went on a concerted campaign to try and discredit the board, given the outcome that had occurred. That got to a point of intimidation, threats being made against board members, social media campaigns, and matters becoming very personal for the board members. The failure of the company was likely to have occurred in any event, but one of the criticisms labelled at the board was that they had also failed to keep the market properly informed of its true financial position. And that led to the FCA becoming involved. Again, not an ideal outcome for any of the board members, who I would suggest didn't quite get there in what governance means and how they were actively engaged in serving their company and their board. As I was preparing for this evening's lecture, I realised that I've come across many assignments where corporate governance has failed, or as a minimum has not been effective. I suspect I could probably go on for many hours if I went through those events during the course of my career, and I'd probably be quite depressed at the end of it, and I don't wish to make any of you depressed along with me. But there are a couple of other matters I'd like to talk through, which again highlight the importance of effective governance and what happens when it's not working. Another thing, the ever hopeful board. During the course of last year, we were engaged on a very urgent basis to support a board of a listed company. Believed it had discovered major issues with its audit. The client was in the tech space and over many years was always indicating It was about to have a step change in the ability to sell its products into its chosen markets, such that investors would likely see a very healthy increase in the market of the company and its shares. In late 2022, that moment seemed to arrive when the company started issuing RNS statements to the stock market advising of significant new business wins. Such announcements became rather regular, and the market reacted very positively, with the share price increasing by a mere 900%. The company then made announcements that it was considering moving its listing to the USA as it felt that the UK stock market was undervaluing tech stocks. From memory, such announcements were made to the media on a Monday. Roll forward to the Thursday of the very same week. It had been established that all of the new business wins did not exist. The board had to suspend trading in the company's shares with immediate effect. Our forensic investigations team led a review on what had happened and established that all of the new business emanated from one individual in the business. The board had been led by an executive chairman who was also a co-founder and a significant shareholder. There was no senior independent director in place. Whilst there was no suspicion of board members having done anything for their personal benefit, there was clearly a lack of healthy scepticism as to why there was a sudden change in the company's fortunes and the evidencing of the same. An emergency fundraise followed at a massive discount to the closing share price from when the shares were suspended. And no major surprise, the executive chairman and the CFO had to leave the business. Somewhat of an extreme matter, but a good example of a board needing to have a healthy degree of scepticism and being able to challenge the executives, particularly where the executives may have a natural bias of trying to focus on good news. The uncontrollable. My final matter is the very public case of BHS, where we acted as both administrators and subsequently liquidators. Our involvement arose from a concern by the Pensions Protection Fund, being the largest creditor, that there was a lack of true independence in dealing with the affairs of BHS when it entered into administration in 2016. The PPF selected FRP, given both our relevant experience and more particularly our independence. Many of you here tonight will recall that BHS had been owned by Sir Philip Green for a number of years, until he sold the company to a consortium led by the well-known, or not so well-known, Dominic Chappell in 2015, for the princely sum of £1. Just over a year later, BHS entered into administration, with the business ceasing to operate and the loss of over 11,000 jobs. In the intervening period, a pretty short period of time, the company's assets had also been significantly depleted. There followed an incredibly public scrutiny of what happened, both in the media, and a journalist for the Sunday Times called Ollie Shah was publishing article after article after article. In fact, he wrote a book on the whole matter. That seemed to be his career cause following Sir Philip Green, along with a select committee inquiry and multiple legal proceedings being issued. Sir Philip Green ultimately entered into a very significant settlement with the pension trustees. Dominic Chappell found himself in prison. There continues to be live legal proceedings as of today against certain of the BHS directors for their conduct. I don't think I need to comment too much on the governance failings that occurred with BHS, many of which are in the public domain. But the consequences have been significant, not least given the most recent pensions legislation that followed, the much increased consequences for trustees and others getting it wrong in the future. I would imagine that a number of people here tonight may have involvement with pension schemes and may potentially be pension trustees. And my take on the most recent legislation is that whilst in theory the changes were well-intentioned and were seeking to avoid a future BHS, the real impact is that it's made being a pension trustee and an advisor to a trustee ever more challenging, which I doubt was the real intention of the legislation. I also think BHS raised some really challenging questions for the wider professional community and how paid advisors play their role in governance. I do not think it is controversial to say that many leading professional service organisations came out of the BHS saga with their reputations somewhat damaged when they were portrayed as either facilitating what happened or turning a blind eye. Professional advisors, and that includes us, almost certainly need to do more to support effective governance, even if that does run the risk of a client seeking to disengage you because you're saying something they don't like. That's what we have to do if we're going to do the right thing by them. So how do we try and ensure effective corporate governance in times of turbulence? Firstly, I think that many organisations are presently experiencing turbulence, so they have not done so for a prolonged period of time. Whilst a simplistic view, organisations have existed in an environment for over 15 years where money has effectively been free. It's been plentiful in supply. Each time the economy has faced challenges, there's been significant government support. We're now entering a period where money is no longer free. Capital is going to be more selective about where it allocates itself. Government support is no longer a given. That is going to create an environment where effective governance in turbulence becomes ever more important. Whilst not exhaustive, I consider that effective governance where challenge existed will arise from experienced leadership who have previously faced challenges, confident leadership who are prepared to debate and challenge, informed boards, inquisitive boards, quality data, appropriate systems and risk policies. However, it does remain important that organisations are still able to operate in an efficient manner and not be overly restricted. It's that natural balance of what one's trying to achieve. A culture of openness which exists throughout the organisation. And succession planning, making sure we're looking to the future. I would add that it's quite rare that we come across people who deliberately seek to ensure that there is either no governance or that it is willfully ignored. That does occur on occasion, but it's often linked to fraud, where there are clearly other motives at play. The reality, however, is that turbulence is likely to mean stress. And under stress, people are prone to either making poor decisions or in certain instances making no decisions. In times of stress, having access to support, be that from colleagues, external advisors, or your own network of contacts, I would suggest is of ever increasing importance as you try and navigate your way through those challenges. I'm aware that your company provides both training and mentoring, and to state the obvious, I think that should continue to be promoted as much as possible in the context of a world where we are likely to continue to see an ongoing element of turbulence. I will finish this evening by saying that I hope everyone here tonight is able to do your part in delivering effective governance for the organisations you may still work with. And most importantly, that you find yourself in a sufficiently supportive environment which allows you to successfully navigate turbulence, because none of us can do this on our own. If we are on our own, it's a very lonely place to be to try and deal with it. Thank you for your time this evening.
Geoff, thank you very much indeed. You will see that Geoff has a lot of insights. I can tell you a great deal more than he's told you there, and some pretty lurid stories as well. So we do appreciate that. Now we're going to have a question and answer session. and Geoff will be up here. I'm going to chair that. We've got the immediate past master to summarise, who's going to join us, and we have the senior warden, Gabriel Williams-Haler, to join us. We've all sat down. Let's have a look at questions. Any burning questions that anybody's got in the room?
Thank you so much for an absolutely excellent talk. I so enjoyed it. And I noticed that you emphasised that you appointed more than one non-exec onto your own board. And I think we could infer why that was, but it would be really good to hear you just set out the huge importance of non-executive directors on a board, and more than one, and what might be the factors that sometimes suffocate them.
So if I go back to our first iteration of having non-execs when we were an LLP, that very much actually came about from having seen what not to do within our former environment. And whilst one of my former partners is here this evening and we were briefly catching up, some of the things we previously saw were truly, I'll go as far as saying, is appalling. Now the positive of that was that gave us a really strong indication of how we wanted to run our business in what I would call the right way. And the benefit of having non-execs from day one, certainly from myself, was actually an element of discipline. So, as I mentioned earlier, I'm still addicted to doing client work and being involved in transactions. I really admit that. But having non-execs meant that, if nothing else, as a matter of absolute courtesy, I attended every board meeting, and we had proper discussions, we had proper debate. Interestingly, when we first interviewed candidates, we did see a couple who solely focused on their governance skill set, and that actually wasn't that compelling. It was more about someone saying, I can help you, guide you, we can deal with governance, but actually I want to be an advocate for your business as well, and I want to help the business develop. And that was a very powerful message, rather than just saying, I can keep you between the lines, whatever phrase one wants to use. So having that external input, people you learn to trust, people you learn to engage with, I think having a challenging relationship in a positive sense is incredibly important. But equally, being able to, we used to take our, well, we still do, we take our board meetings around the country to engage with colleagues, and that often ends up with having a glass of wine, and I've never had a glass of wine with Mr. Edge. But that whole relationship thing is key. And now we roll forward into our PLC environment. Obviously there is a greater element of structure. We have a REMCO, we have a NOMCO, we have an audit and risk committee. We just had a new chair appointed. And we've actually just gone through, which we literally concluded yesterday, a choice for a new non-exec. And we were faced with brilliant candidates, but in the end you also look at this around not just people's experience, but do you feel you have a connection with them, that you're going to get on, that you, as I say, you can positively challenge. But my interaction with non-execs has only been positive. Now I have one of my exec colleagues who on occasions gets quite frustrated by, he sees as some of the limitations of being asked questions. I'm like, who cares? Ask questions, challenge us, because if we can't answer them to the people in our own boardroom, then we're not going to do very well when we're talking to investors or other stakeholders from there. So it's a long-winded answer, but that I've genuinely seen value throughout our existence of having that independence and I guess clarity of thought, because as an exec it's so easy that you're in the weeds, you're in there, and having other people who are around you who have slightly more perspective can be incredibly helpful.
think this is a terribly important point, because I think what a lot of people forget is that people who get appointed as non-executive directors don't necessarily know how to be a non-executive director. So, you know, one of the key things for governance professionals is to make sure non-executives are trained, so they actually know what it is they're there to do. Because a lot of them don't really know. And some of them will try and become executive, which is completely wrong. Some of them will say, well, I was appointed because I'm an accountant, so I'm only going to think about finance. That's completely wrong. You're non-exec, you're involved in everything. And it's really, really important for non-execs to understand they're part of the team. They're not sitting above the team, they're not sitting away from the team. They are actually part of the team doing the job that's needed, which is to support, collaborate, and communicate with the executive to make the executive do a better job, to help the executive do a better job. And I think that's really, really important. And I mean, I'm involved in a number of things on a non-exec basis, and I find the business is really, really interesting. And my business background is not always relevant to what I'm looking at, but I can apply it to what I look at. But I'm doing it on the basis that I'm trying to make you guys be better at what you do. And the biggest guilty thing for non-execs in my career history is that there are too many non-execs who don't read the papers. And you really got to read the papers. I mean, you've got to understand what this business is doing to actually do your job properly. So, but to a group of governance professionals, my message is train your non-execs, and then they will do a really good job for you.
I'll just make one comment myself. I became chairman of, well, just think of the most desperate company you've ever seen. It was worse than that. It was a rags to rags story and gone through a lot of riches on the way. And it was like a public company in the sense that you got a range of shareholders, but they were all pretty well known private equity shareholders. And the whole thing had gone wrong. I'm going to make only one simple point, that the story is really quite interesting, but this particular part of the story is, when I got there, I hadn't been appointed chairman at this point. Basically, in these circumstances, you get appointed chairman so that the banks can beat you up rather than the others. And in this particular case, there were two pretty distinguished non-executive directors. One was very distinguished, and the other one was even more distinguished, a really great city grandee. And the fairly distinguished one, as soon as an appointment was made, ran for the hills. And the other one, who got so much to lose, and it'd be somebody many of you will know, did not leave. Stayed, partially to keep me under control. But it was an article of faith in the management team, because he'd been with them ever since they set this up. And the most valuable thing that this really distinguished non-exec did was to give them confidence to do difficult stuff they never wanted to do, they'd never done before, now they had to do. Any more questions?
Past Master Mike Dunning. Can I follow on from the immediate past Master's comment? It seems to me that your firm is concentrating its efforts on making good after a crisis has arisen. Would you not be better placed training board members before a crisis happens?
Well, the logical answer to that would be yes. But as I referenced in my speech, regrettably, one of the things I've not seen in my career, which is a reasonable period of time now, is actually that openness to people wanting to address things at an earlier stage. And as much as I might want to try, we can't force ourselves onto people. And it's a very real matter for us, because business culture we often face now when we go to see people who it is fairly obvious need to do something. If you are direct with them or too direct, they will ask you to leave the room because they do not want to address that issue. And my profession as a whole spends a lot of time trying to encourage people to engage at an early point and for people to upskill. I mean, I get the point that most boards don't necessarily want to focus on what to do when it goes wrong. they're trying to deliver successful businesses. But it is a genuine challenge that we do not have a business culture, from what I see, where people are open to addressing those challenges. And I know we couldn't just go out there and say, you need this, and you should take our services, because we'd be stood on street corners with not a lot to do if that was our message.
Another question at the back, I think, there.
Please, if I can. I'm conscious that thus far, when you're called in especially, it's gone wrong. I'm looking at any lessons you could identify for us of good governance without hindsight, because I'm conscious, reflecting certainly from my own organisation, once we don't know if we've got good governance in place, and when we have it in place and nothing goes wrong, then that means you can remove one thing. There's a little bit of cost, or it's a little bit of risk, or it's a little bit of something else. And it's trying to identify what those rules are, what that best practice is, so you know when you've got the sweet spot. Any guidance gratefully appreciated.
That's a tough question. And to some degree, you only find out whether you've got it right when it goes wrong. In a slightly different way, I've always said that in the context of the support we receive from our wider team, is I'll only find out whether they really support us when we get it wrong. But on that governance point, I think the fundamental position around it is, in a positive way, continuing to challenge and assess whether within your group, again, from a listed environment now, we have the benefit that in due course you will rotate directors, because the code is that you can't be there forever and a day. So in theory, you've got a world where fresh ideas and there's new people coming in who are hopefully going to keep a board invigorated. But I think in the end, you've got to be a judge yourself as to whether or not you look around the room and you feel that as a board you are delivering for what your organisation seeks in whatever its strategy, plans are or otherwise, and that, yes, ultimately you're never complacent. We've always had a view that the day we think we've achieved is probably the start of when we find out that we have definitely not achieved. We try and keep ourselves, focused by not taking things for granted.
Thank you. I think one of the things you said that really resonated with me is about the board being in denial. And having been a company secretary with a medium-sized private company many years ago, we had a relatively good governance framework in place. We had regular board meetings. We had external investors who were all very well qualified. And month after month, we were looking at declining profits, and it was quite extraordinary, the psychology of the board. And that's one of the things I'd like to say is board evaluation, how important that is, because you need the right people on the board and the right challenges. And watching these directors who were literally in denial, I just found it amazing. That they could be in denial. And then we got to the point where, I had to take the CEO into a room and say, you need advice. You've got to go and get advice now, because, and I think other insolvency practitioners call it, you're now in the twilight zone. Your finances and your cash flow is so bad that we're now in danger of where normally the board, they're looking out for shareholder value, you now should be looking out for your creditors. And he didn't like that. He stomped out, just wouldn't talk to me for about 2 days. And then I just said, I insist you get advice. So thank you for talking about denial.
Sorry, you want some help in terms of identifying this. When I first started in investment back in the 1980s. One of the senior fund managers had two strict rules in terms of investing in companies. It's the first, he would never invest in a company whose chief executive was bigger than the company. And he'd never invest in a company whose chief executive had a beard. As you can imagine, Alan Sugar never invested in him. The second was a little facetious. The first has an awful lot of truth in it. And looking in organisations for people who are too big, who have too much power, who have too much influence, who everybody seems to think is irreplaceable, and they're doing things, well, no one else can do that, they're really doing. Those are all signs that things are going wrong. And successful companies are teams, and successful teams of people working together. As soon as you get people starting to be too big for that team, for me, it's a massive alarm bell that the governance of the company is falling down. So that's one tip for you.
Next question.
Geoff, do you have a view on the ideal composition of an effective board? That is, say, the ratio of non-execs to execs, how many execs you should have on, how many non-execs in the company?
I'll have to qualify by the fact that I can't say I've sat on multiple boards and therefore, can give you that. We have 3 execs and 4 non-execs, and I would suggest that is, for the size of business that we are, that is effective. I think if we had any more, I could see us losing effectiveness in the context of people understanding their roles and people being able to engage, in a timely manner. One of the issues that we discuss as a board is how, it's not about saying, hey, let's have a short board meeting, but let's not have board meetings that run on for hours and hours and hours. And by the end of it, people have lost the will to live and, forgotten what they discussed at the start of it. So, all of this feeds into effectiveness. So, but again, Philip, I think it comes back to the point that ultimately effectiveness isn't just about numbers or whatever. It is about what that composition of the board looks like. And I'm very interested about the training for NEDs. So we have one of our NEDs who joined us from a Big Four, who did what we did do for a living. And 4 years in, we're just about getting rid of when I was at PwC, this is what I did. It's like, we're not at PwC. But in all seriousness, in the context, it's been quite interesting to see someone learning to be a NED. I'm very open with both our investors and our board. I am still firmly in the phase of learning how to be a CEO in the context of a board, and I know there's much that I get wrong. Some of it I get right, but you've got to keep learning. And again, to the point around the idea that anyone sits in that room with a monopoly on good ideas, or it's their idea or no idea. But I am most taken by and I'm not educated, but I don't think there's that many NEDs who necessarily go to and get trained. I think a lot of it is that they move from an executive career to say, well, what I'll do now is I'll have a pluralist, I'll become a NED, and I can do that because I was a successful exec. And I suspect the issue of being a really effective NED and having training for that is something that is massively undervalued. Presumably an opportunity for the company.
James, do you want to comment on what you looked for in the past on boards?
I think it's a very interesting one. I think for an awful lot of organisations, actually, you don't need a lot of executives on the board because there is an executive team. I suspect most of the business, serious business in your business, Geoff, is conducted at exec committee meetings. That's where the business is really run. So actually, you can have a board that's predominantly non-exec and perhaps just have the chief executive as the only executive on it. So I think it varies from company to company, and it depends to some extent on what that company does. But fundamentally, I think boards are better when they're predominantly non-exec, and there's a broad range of backgrounds and skills on the board, contributing effectively, hopefully, across the various different activities of the company, using their backgrounds and experience. And I absolutely understand, because I've seen it more than once, exactly what Geoff's saying about the chap from PwC. Well, this is the way we used to do it. That's not what you're there as a non-exec to do, and I think it's looking at things dispassionately and differently, asking questions in a friendly and collaborative way. And actually, if executives respond in the right way, then actually you have a very, very effective business, and you end up doing business better. So I'm personally in favour of boards that are predominantly non-exec. So I don't think you need a lot of execs on boards, because I think companies are run by exec teams, not by the boards, even though the boards take responsibility.
Next question. Yes, there are.
Thank you.
It's like a bat's office, isn't it?
I was just wondering about, there's been a lot of coverage in the press recently about councils that have been going into administration, and especially some of the ones that have not been audited for 3 or 4 years. And I was just wondering, Woking, for example, has got £2 billion worth of debt that they're working through, Birmingham City Council, Nottingham City Council, those kind of big ones. What do you see as the transferable learnings from those councils that cannot go into administration? We cannot lose them in the same way we could lose a company.
Yeah, so I've actually got some experience of this, because we've had close interaction with one of the local authorities who sadly put a very significant amount of money into a business that we're dealing with and are going to lose the majority of that. Slightly not answering your question, but fundamentally this whole thing with local authorities and the money they're losing, it's basically a scandal that emanates from central government, when George Osborne came up with the bright idea of cutting local authority budgets, but telling local authorities they could borrow unlimited funds from the public sector board, or whatever it was called, at a very low interest rate, and whatever profits they made they could bring back into their operating budget and all would be fine. Unfortunately, no one considered the consequences of what happens if you lose it. And then I think of greater concern from what we've seen is, unfortunately, public sector employees were preyed upon by the commercial sector, offering them not far off get-rich-quick schemes. People who were not qualified to make very significant investment decisions were doing so, and the ultimate outcome is, a position where special measures are now in place. Ultimately, the local residents will be paying significantly increased council tax bills, probably for between 10 to 20 years, to deal with the deficits that are arisen. I mean, the fundamental problem on that is that I don't think it's about a skill set position per se, that these local authorities are in a terrible place, that absent central government admitting that they might have been the authors of said issue, I don't see what the resolution to that is, other than you go through these formulaic positions of whatever, I think it is section 114 notices or whatever they are that get issued, and but it is sadly in a different form, a really bad case study of the impact of. You can say lack of governance in the context. Of course, you could sit there and say, well, why didn't local authorities and council members stop this? Why didn't they say, we're not qualified, we shouldn't be doing this? But equally, if you're being told that your budget is being cut, and that's the only way you are being offered the solution of trying to make sure you can deliver services, you can see that's difficult. But I would hope, I'm not necessarily that confident, that in the future, the way local authorities are tasked with managing these things, or the way they are effectively governed, allows for a more robust approach to people challenging, why are we doing this? But yeah, it's a big problem, because it's billions and billions of pounds that are involved.
And I've been, in the past, a Common Councilman on the City of London Corporation, so I know a little bit about local government, central government. The biggest problem is that the people who are sort of arguably doing the governance are elected, not appointed. And you can't control who gets elected. And there's an awful lot of people who could add or make an enormous contribution to local or national government, but wouldn't, under any circumstances, put themselves up for election on any basis. Either because they don't like the process or they don't like the political parties or whatever else it is. It's always interesting if you draw a comparison between local government and schools, for example. Schools tend to be much better run than local authorities because, the schools, you're appointing governors, you're finding good governors, you're looking for them. They're not just elected, they're not people that are just put up. And I think that's one of the problems with, with local government. When I was a Common Council on the City of London Corporation, I sat on the Finance Committee, and we kept fairly close tabs on what the Chamberlain was doing and the Chamberlain's department were doing. There were a number of us who were quite senior city people who actually understood finance deeply. You don't always find that in government. But politicians aren't necessarily business people. Politicians tend to be professional politicians, they've always been one, or they tend to come out of education of some sort or some other area, but they don't tend to be business people. So there are fundamental problems where you're putting the wrong sort of skill bases into governance roles where significant amounts of money are involved. And, I think it's a challenge for political parties to think about whether actually, with the experience of some of these councils, whether or not governance could change. The other example of this has been in the church, where there's a big cathedrals measure's gone through, which has put loads of new non-execs into cathedral organisations, organisational structures, because cathedrals have been going bust. Because you can't trust a clergyman in charge of a budget. That's not what they're there for. They're there as priests. They're interested in the cure of souls, not in running a business that might be £5-10 million turnover. The church has recognised the problem. They've changed the way they're structured, and now a lot of independent people involved in cathedrals. I can see one looking at me right now. And I think it's really, really important. And I think perhaps local government needs to think about that as well.
Thank you very much. I think there's one further question down on this side.
Thank you very much. I found this extremely interesting this evening, but I'd just like to bring up a challenge to something you said, James, and just to get the opinion of the panel, to have one exec on the board. I've seen a bully of an exec with the pipsqueak of a finance director and no one else, and you're hearing one story about the business. So my challenge is, and the one I agree with you, is non-execs should exceed execs, potentially even excluding the chairman, so that you do get that independent voice. But to keep your numbers down, one chief exec, 3 others, 2 others, how do you know you are getting the truth, the real truth, rather than that version of the truth from the exec side? So I sometimes think it's useful to have chief exec, finance, and potentially chief ops, marketing, business development, somebody else who's in the doing side and is the next most senior person in the business. So I challenge the view, would that add value or make my board too big?
The simple answer to that, Sharon, from my perspective, is that you don't have to be a member of the board to attend board meetings. And, I would expect, if there was 1 or only 2 executives on the board, perhaps just the chief executive and the finance director were the only directors, but you'd still expect a lot of the exec team to turn up to board meetings to talk about their areas of the business or whatever. A board wouldn't be doing its job if it wasn't interrogating the senior executives across the business. So I don't think they have to be directors, but I entirely agree with you boards can't just talk to the chief exec or the finance director. They have to talk to the full range of execs. But I would expect those full range of execs to turn up to meetings, but they don't necessarily need to sit as directors.
Can I just add to that? In certain companies, I think you can't have too few directors because that poses a risk, like you're saying, Sharon, that somebody is actually calling the tune and there aren't enough challenges. And on risk registers that can come up. You don't want a huge number of directors because you don't want it to be too unwieldy and ungovernable. But certainly in larger companies, and it's all, you know, appropriate to the size of the company and what you're doing, but in larger companies you should have a reasonable size board actually in place and operative. And for company secretaries amongst us, we're a conduit for the non-executive directors, and we're very much in a very special position because we should be the go-to point person for them. And equally, it works the other way round with your senior independent non-exec, that the company secretary can feel that they, even though they report into the chairman or the CEO, maybe as an employee, that they do have a line into those non-executive directors and can talk to them. And certainly when you've got remcoms and nomcoms where the executives aren't attending, as company secretary, that's a very important relationship.
I mean, for me, and it's a very personal thing, I would not want to be there on my own because my CFO is way more talented than I am. So that's just an entirely selfish position as to where we are. But to your point, I mean, from our perspective, we have our head of IT come and present. We have our chief people officer come and present. You know, we have that whole thing where it is around a wider engagement from there. So that's what I agree. I mean, if you had just hearing one view logically would give rise to the risk of you're not getting the true story, you know, of what's going on. So.
Thanks very much. As Peter Swaby, it was great to hear Gabrielle banging the drum for the company secretary. Thanks for that. Yeah, well, with the exception of training for non-executive directors, and full disclosure, that's a service provided by a certain well-known professional body. What would be your top tip for the company secretary or governance professional? How can they help avoid their board getting into this sort of situation?
I think in the end that comes down to confidence that they are not just there for some sort of governance purpose of saying we have a list of things to go through this month on the agenda, we tick them. I mean, it's exactly to your point of saying I'm taking that CEO into a room and saying enough, you know. And I think so for that is having a company secretary that is properly part of the board and the management of the business, rather than being seen as undertaking some form of administrative function. And I think as I understand, that's what you're trying to develop more into fact that there is a real value add around what the company secretary brings. Now, for our business as a PLC, our company secretary is brilliant because they're forever telling us you need to be aware of this update, and you know they're the ones who are assimilating a lot of knowledge and bringing that to us in a very clear and focused manner. Perfectly honestly, I don't have the time to do, I mean, I'm sufficiently inefficient that I don't find the time to do it. But, so I think that's the thing around really advocating that it's the value you bring rather than it's a process.
Good. Well, thank you very much, everybody. Thank you to the panel. Splendid contributions. And thank you for your engagement. Let's continue over a glass of wine.